Hello, my name is Jim Comstock-Galligan, and I have been a disability rights attorney for the past 40 years, and I have devoted my career to representing children with disabilities and their families on a variety of education issues. Today, I am going to speak about 4 educational topics that have a significant impact on the educational careers of children, adolescents, and young adults with disabilities. The first subject I'm going to talk about today is the issue of inclusion. And this is an issue that a lot of people in our society think is an issue that's only about people with disabilities. But actually, the issue of inclusion is an issue that is important to everyone. So I have entitled this section, Inclusion Matters to Everyone, because I hope by the end of this presentation you will recognize that that is true, first. Second, I think with the issue of inclusion and its importance to everyone, we can really begin to understand a couple of major points that I think are forgotten in our schools. And one is that inclusion is something that people without disabilities take for granted, but people with disabilities oftentimes feel like they have to earn. And that, to me, is a fundamental difference for kids in our schools. The vast majority of kids who are without disabilities go to school, and they're naturally included. Yet kids with disabilities and their families have to fight to be included. The reality is that inclusion is critical to every child, and I'm going to talk about it in the following context. I hope through the issue of inclusion to change the way that if you're a parent, that you see yourself, number one. Number two, how you see yourself in relation to any son or daughter, sister, brother, mother or father who has a disability. And number three, just generally how you see the world around you. So I hope to accomplish that in the next 45 minutes. So let's begin with going back to one of my original statements, with the reality that inclusion matters to everyone, not just students with disabilities and adults with disabilities. Now, probably the most important issue with respect to inclusion is the issue of accommodations. I think the key to inclusion for every single person in the United States today, no matter where you are, the most important issue to your inclusion, whether you be at work, whether you be at some workout facility, fitness club, whether you be at a restaurant, no matter where you are today, what you do, the issue of accommodations is going to be critical to you having an inclusive life today. So I consider accommodations to be the DNA of community life. So here's the first reality about accommodations. Everyone needs accommodations to function in inclusive school, work, and community settings. Everyone. And as a result, we are far more alike than we are different. We oftentimes look at people with disabilities, which I myself am a person with a disability, and I have seen this throughout my life. People look at me as if I'm different. But the reality is that unlike every other person I'm going to meet today, I need accommodations just like they do to function in inclusive school, work, and community settings. So as with every person I encounter today, we are far more alike than we are different. And this idea that some people are far more different than others, i.e. people with disabilities, and thus we can treat them far differently than others, is a fallacy and has only hurt the opportunities for people with disabilities to be included. So We all need accommodations to function in inclusive settings. As a result, we are far more alike than different. Now, accommodations. They are the DNA of community life. In fact, they're the universal thread of community life. They're also the linchpin, the anchor rod of all disability rights legislation. Section 504 of the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Fair Housing Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The cornerstone of all of those pieces of legislation is accommodations. So, what do we know? I think what we know if we think about this carefully is that far too accommodations are being made for students with disabilities in our schools. And that includes students with Prader-Willi syndrome. The result is far too many students with disabilities remain in segregated, self-contained settings. So, and here's the irony. Every human needs accommodations to function and thrive in community life. Indeed, no matter where you are listening to this webinar, numerous accommodations are being made for each and every one of us, each and every day in the community. So, let's talk about some of the accommodations that are being made in the room that I'm sitting in. I'm sitting in a conference room in New Orleans, Louisiana. I look around this room, and here's some of the accommodations that I see are being made for me. I'm going to be speaking today for between 3 and 4 hours. The first accommodation I notice are the lights. Imagine trying to do this in the dark. It would be difficult. The second accommodation is, it's cold here, the heat is on. As human beings, going back to the lights, we don't function very well in the dark unless you're visually impaired. Otherwise, we just don't do very well in the dark. So we have created lights to accommodate that human limitation that we have. Heat and air conditioning. You know, when it's cold, we don't function very well. So in order to accommodate that we can't think very straight when we're shivering, we have created heat to accommodate that human limitation. And in the summer, we use air conditioning because we also don't function very well when we're hot. We just don't. So those are two immediate accommodations that have been made for me in the room that I'm speaking in. 3, a chair. I'm sitting in a chair. Imagine if I had to stand here for the next 4 hours and hold all of my stuff. Not going to work. Another basic human limitation is we're not able to stand for 4 hours and hold all of our things. We're not able to stand for 4 hours generally, much less hold anything. And so in order to accommodate the holding of things, the chair accommodates not having to stand on. There's a table here. I have a variety of things on the table. I have a microphone system to amplify my voice. That's another accommodation that's being made. So is the table, obviously. I have a keyboard. I have a computer. All of these things are accommodations that are being made so that I can do this presentation. One of the things I did is I called in. I used a phone to call in so that I can speak through a microphone system using the phone. Now imagine calling into some place in Florida without a phone. Just saying, hey, can you hear me in Florida? Can we do this now? Basic human limitation that we have is if we're more than about 50 feet apart, we don't hear each other very well. So we have created the telephone to accommodate that basic human limitation that we have. So in this room right now, there are lights, there's heat, there's a chair for me, there's a table, there's a microphone, there's a telephone, there's a computer keyboard and screen. I have a notepad and a pen. Why do we have notepads and pens? Because if we don't write things down, I have notes for my presentation today. If we don't write these things down, we're likely to forget them. That's another human limitation that we have. Fail to write something down, likely to forget it. So we've created things like pens and pencils, as well as computers, so that we can record things to remember them. But all of these accommodations address human limitations that each of us have, and that we've accommodated so that we can function in an inclusive environment. Now, accommodations. Think you don't use them? Think again. This woman that you see on the screen is working on probably one of the most common work sites in the United States today. She may be a lawyer, she may be an architect, she may be an accountant, you know, she may be she could be one of any 30 or 40 professions. But this is where she works. She's in an office. And if you start looking at the number of accommodations that have been made for her so that she can function in an inclusive work environment, you will find that at a minimum, there are 15. And let's begin with what they are. First, there's lights. You can be sure there are lights on above her. She also has a lamp on. She's doubling up on the lights issue because we don't function very well in the dark. You can be sure there's AC or heat on. It's likely that the air conditioning is on, and this was taken in the summer since she's wearing short sleeves. She has a chair, because imagine standing 8 hours a day at your job. She has a table, because can you imagine her holding all of this stuff in her arms while she's standing for 8 hours? She's not going to be able to work without the accommodations of a chair and a table and lights and AC. What else do you see? Yes, she has a telephone, because she's not going to be able to speak to anyone more than about 30, 40 feet away from her. So that accommodates that human limitation. If you look carefully by the telephone, you will see she has a stapler. Why do we use staplers? Because if we don't keep papers together, we're likely to what? Lose them. That's just kind of a human trait. She also has, next to the stapler, you'll see that she has paper clips. Serve the same purpose, help us keep things organized so we don't lose them. She also has a date stamp, because oftentimes, if you say she's a lawyer, she's going to get documents, it's important to stamp when you get them. Because if you don't, you're not going to remember when the document arrived. Doesn't matter what the date is on the document, you're not going to be able to remember when it arrived. So that date stamp accommodates another human limitation, and that is memory limitations. She also has a computer and a keyboard. She also has what looks like a calendar, because if we don't write things down on a calendar, we're not going to remember them 2 or 3 days from now. Some of us won't remember them tomorrow. She also has a holder for the calendar, because it's easier to see instead of her straining her neck all the time looking down. And that holder where the calendar is can also be used to hold documents that she's typing. She has a printer. She also has, if you'll notice closest to, as you begin to look at the screen, she has a pen and a paper. So this woman, in order for her to perform her job, needs the following 15 accommodations: lights, AC and heat, a chair, a desk, telephone, stapler, paper clips, date stamp, pen, paper, computer, printer, keyboard, calendar, paper holder. She is also wearing a watch, if you look at her arm. Because if we don't wear a thing like a watch, we could miss appointments. Tell us what time it is. All of these accommodations that are made for her to function, we never think about this, but she has 16 accommodations to human limitations that she has so that she can do her job in a very inclusive work environment. Now, as I've said, accommodations are necessary in every community setting: home, school, work, social settings, etc. Why do we need accommodations? Why does that woman we just looked at, why does she need 16 accommodations? She needs accommodations like each and every one of us in order to overcome basic human limitations that she and we have. So, what is a disability? Let's think about this for a second. A disability is nothing more than a basic human limitation. Who has those? Everyone. As humans, we have myriad human limitations. and extensive capabilities. But we all have human limitations. And accommodations, they make every human less limited, less disabled. But we all have human limitations. A person with a disability is exactly the same as any other person. They have human limitations just like any other person. Just like this woman who needs 16 accommodations to her human limitations in order to function in an inclusive work environment. 16. So, we all have human limitations, and we all need accommodations in order to overcome those limitations that we have. But we like to think in our schools in America that only kids with disabilities need accommodations. Well, here's the truth. If you go into any teacher's classroom, any teacher in the United States, on average, she or he will have 14 to 18 accommodations that are being made so that she or he can function as a teacher. If you walk into any principal's office in a school in America and you look around the room, you will notice that every principal in this country needs approximately 12 to 16 accommodations for her or him to function in their job in an inclusive setting. But yet, when we go to an IEP meeting, an individual education plan meeting, or a Section 504 plan, and I will explain those in a little bit, everyone around the room, all the adults talk like it's only the kid with a disability in the school. The only kid in the school who needs accommodations is the kid we're having the meeting on. No one ever looks inward at all the accommodations that have been made for them. So, and this is a really important point. You know, as I said, accommodations help us overcome our various human limitations. They help us utilize our abilities and function in inclusive, natural community settings. And guess what else? When you're in a meeting at a school and you're asking for accommodations for your son or your daughter, one of the things that I always do as a lawyer is I will say, we're asking for these 3 accommodations. But let me go over the 14 to 17 accommodations any of you who are teachers at this meeting are getting already. I can tell you what they are in your classroom because I've been in hundreds of them. And Ms. Johnson, the principal, let me at least talk about the 12 to 16 accommodations you're receiving today. So in order to understand the context of asking for 3 accommodations for my client, this student who happens to have Prader-Willi syndrome, we need to think about it in the context of how many accommodations have been made for everybody in this room. If you're a teacher, it's this many. If you're a principal, it's 12 to 16, 14 to 18 if you're a teacher. So we're talking about 3 for my client. It gives a whole new context to the issue of accommodations. 1, you begin the conversation by everyone now begins to understand that accommodations have to be made for everyone in order for people to function. And number 2, the number of accommodations you're asking for are far fewer than the number of accommodations being received by other people in the room. It makes the request a lot more reasonable. So, the bottom line, accommodations. We all need them. Every single person, every single day for community life. And you know, I forgot a couple of the ones that we encounter in our work life every day. If you happen to work downtown somewhere in the United States or in an office building, how do you get into an office building? Typically, historically, there would be stairs. You know why there are stairs? It accommodates people's human limitation of not being able to fly. That's why there are stairs. Because if the building sits more than about a half a foot off the ground, we're not going to be able to get into it because as humans, we cannot fly. That's a human limitation we have. So we built steps. But the problem with steps is not everybody can use them. So now ramps are required. But that's not a special accommodation. I want to be absolutely clear. That is not a special accommodation. The reality is everybody needs to be accommodated to get in a building that's more than a foot above the ground. You can either have steps and or a ramp. But the ramp that I would use as a person with a disability accommodates the same human limitation that people who are using the steps have. Neither of us can fly. We are exactly the same. But who can use a ramp? Everyone. It accommodates everybody's human limitations regarding inability to fly. And when you get in that building and you go to the third floor, how do you typically get there? We take an elevator, most people. Unless you're working out, you might take the steps. But we'll take an elevator because, once again, that elevator accommodates our inability to fly. Another human limitation that we have. So, as you look around, it's important to change the way that you see the world around you, because you will be far more effective in advocating for your children, or your brother or sister, or mother or father, if you see the world from the perspective of we are far more alike than we are different, and that there's no shame in having human limitations because everybody has them, and everyone needs accommodations in order to function. So, you can read these next things, this next slide. It's pretty much what I've just been talking about. Going to the next slide. You know, if as humans we make accommodations for ourselves, like adults in our schools, we make accommodations so that we can function and live in the community or work in a school, then we need to make accommodations for students with disabilities so that they can function in inclusive settings in our schools and in our communities. This is just a question of equity, fundamental fairness, and equal protection of the law. I mean, do we really want our schools to be run on the philosophy, you know, I got my accommodations, but you aren't getting yours? Is that what public education should be about? Or should it be about, I understand that I need a lot of accommodations as a teacher in this building, or as a principal, or as a cafeteria worker, and I understand that I have a lot of human limitations, that I need accommodations, and I understand, you know, your son or daughter also has human limitations like me. And since I'm getting accommodations, we're going to do what we absolutely have to in order to ensure your son or daughter gets them. That's the kind of schools I want. And it's the kind of schools we're more likely to get if we create a context for people to understand their own human limitations and how we're far more alike than we are different. Now, here's another truth. For those who say that inclusion is not important and that segregation is okay for people with disabilities, I'm 65. I've been practicing law for 40 years. Here's what I've noticed about people who say that. They never conceive of themselves in segregated settings. They have a remarkable inability also to generalize segregation to their own lives. You know, it's fine for someone else, but it's not fine for them to be segregated. But we never make them create that juxtaposition, create that dichotomy where, really, it's okay to segregate people with disabilities? Really? How would that work for you? If it was you we were talking about segregating. So here's what my experience has taught me. And it's this second truth. For every person, where you receive services is critically important. Critically important. And I'm going to go through a couple of these examples. Let's start with Vic and Natalie's. Imagine this. Imagine you're going out to dinner tonight with your children, if you have children, with your spouse or your significant other, regardless of what your sexual orientation may be, and you're going out with your parents. And yes, I understand some of you may no longer have parents, but just imagine you are going out to dinner with your parents. I've lost my parents, but I often think of them when I give this example, think about how they would react to this. So here we are. We're going out to dinner with our parents. We show up at Vic and Natalie's. We walk in the door. My parents' names were Bernice and Cy. So I walk in the door with my spouse, Charlene, my daughter, Megan, who's 32, and my parents. It's the holiday season. And as we walk into Vic and Natalie's, the woman behind the podium where they greet you when you walk in looks over at my mom and dad and says to them, "Welcome to Vic and Natalie's. I don't know if you know this, but recently we've opened up a new elderly section." Now imagine how your parents are going to feel about this. I can just see my dad already. We just opened up this new elderly section, and that's where you'll be sitting tonight. But you're going to love it. And let me tell you some of the features of it. It's very unique, and it's really going to address your dining needs. One, we have a larger menu. There are more items to choose from on the menu in the elderly section. Number two, we have a smaller customer to waiter-waitress ratio. So you're going to get a lot more attention, individual attention. And number three, we have, the section where you're going to be sitting has help available to you if you need help in getting your meal. So remember that. Larger menu to choose from. Think about this in the school context, i.e. more services, lower customer to waiter-waitress ratio, i.e. smaller pupil-teacher ratio, and there'll be people there to more help is available to you. Now, this is the rationale that is often used to segregate kids. Now, imagine this rationale being used to segregate your parents in a restaurant. I can see my dad, Cy Galligan, right now, looking at the woman behind the podium and saying, "You've got to be frickin' kidding me. We are here with our son and daughter-in-law and our granddaughter. You think we're going to go sit in an elderly section? Really? You couldn't be more mistaken." That's what my parents would say. Imagine going into a restaurant and being told there is an elderly section for you, for your parents. Or like me, and now I'm 65. I've become my parents' age in this story. I would be just like my father, Cy, outraged that I go out to dinner with my daughter and her friends. That's the second example I'm going to give here. And I'm told, and my wife, Charlene, that we have to sit in an elderly section. You know, where people receive services really matter, and that would be absolutely unacceptable to me. Next, think about this example. Think about going out to a movie today with friends. What is today? Tuesday. You're doing this presentation on a Tuesday. Imagine going to a movie tonight. And as you walk up to the window to buy your tickets, the person behind the window, he or she, some guy, let's say, says to you, looks at the women in the group and says, I don't know if you know this, but we've all, to the women in this group, it looks like there are 4 of you and 4 guys, but I don't know if you know this, but we've recently opened a women's section in our theater. And we've done a lot of research. We actually have an analytic guy here, or woman, and we have determined what movies we believe women are really interested in. And so we have this new women's section, and even though we show 16 movies here, we have selected 4 specific movies for women based upon analytics and movies that we know you're going to be interested in. So here are the 4 movies that you can choose from. Which of these 4 would you like to go to? And no, you won't be able to sit with the people you came with. But here's the 4 movies you can choose from. No, you can't choose the other 12. You're restricted to these 4. But let me tell you about some of the positives here. The theaters in the new women's section have direct lines of sight. There are no, obstructed viewpoints. They have plusher seats, more leg room. So trust me, there are some real benefits to seeing a movie in the women's section. Now, women out there who are listening to this, how are you going to feel about that? Take a moment, think about if someone said that to you, told you how your choices were now extremely limited, and that you had to see one of the movies that they had selected for you. I think most women in our society would be outraged by that, just like my mother and father and myself and Charlene would be outraged by the elderly section restaurant example. Where we receive services really matters. Here's the last one. I am a person with a disability. I use an electric scooter. It's called a go-go scooter. And yes, it goes. This past Sunday, well, 2 Sundays ago, if I had gone to a Saints game in the New Orleans Superdome with friends, let's say I went with Charlene and 6 of our friends. We go up to the gate to buy tickets at the Superdome for the game. This is what would happen to me. Somebody's going to, well, let's put it in a context that will magnify what's going to happen to me. Imagine we go up to the window. There's 8 of us. There's 4 Hispanics, 2 African Americans, and Charlene and I happen to be Anglo. We're all friends. We're going to the Saints game. We walk up to the gate to buy our tickets. The person behind the counter looks to the African American couple who are friends of ours. I don't know if you know this, but we've recently opened an African American section at the Superdome. Yeah, imagine that. We've recently opened an African American section at the Superdome. And you're really going to love it, because here's the reality. It's really close to the field, you're right down, almost on the playing field, direct lines of sight. It's going to give you like one of the best views in the entire Superdome of the game. So here's the other deal, however. You can only take one person with you. So each of you is welcome to take one of your friends. That would be 4 of you. The other 4 are going to have to sit somewhere else. So where would you like, let me show you where the seating is in the African American section. Where would you like to sit? Now, you can substitute Hispanic. You can substitute white. You can substitute Asian, Native American in this example. Imagine how you would feel if you walked up there and was told there's a new Native American section at the Superdome, a new Hispanic section at the Superdome, a new Asian section at the Superdome, and that's where you're going to have to sit based upon your race. I think people would be outraged. Where we receive services really matters, and we want inclusive services in our lives. But if I went up to the Superdome 2 weeks ago, I would be told that there is a disabled seating section. And that's the truth. That there is a disabled seating section. And that I'm really going to like it because it's very close to the field. It has one of the best views in the Superdome. But it is the disabled seating section. And I'm there with Charlene Comstock-Galligan, my better half, and 6 of our friends, and we're each told we can bring one. And because I'm the only person with a disability, I can bring one friend, i.e., that would be Charlene Comstock-Galligan. So I'm going to be segregated and separated from my other 6 friends. That's exactly what would have happened to me if I'd gone to the Superdome 2 weeks ago. And the idea that we would have an African American, Latino, white, or Asian American, Native American section, that idea would really be deemed unconscionable in our society today. But because we continue to think people with disabilities are far more different than we are, it's still okay to have a disabled section in sporting arenas today. Candidly, if you're not willing to operate an African American, Anglo, Latino, Asian American, Native American segregated section in the Superdome, which you're not, and will never be created, then you should never have a disability section either. Because that is segregation. And it angers me just as much as it would anger anyone else based upon their race? Or what about an elderly section at the Superdome if we created segregation based on age? People, I mean, you know, this is the truth. People want to be included. They don't want to be segregated. And not only is it unconscionable, but in our society today, people view it as outrageous that someone would suggest they sit in an elderly section, an African American section, or what have you. No one is going to be subjected to that based upon their race or age. But people with disabilities are still subject to disability sections and disability sections in our schools, oftentimes known as special education segregated classrooms. Where we receive services really matters. And trust me, it matters to kids as well. So, let's talk about inclusion now. Because where we receive services does really matter, and people want to be included. What's the definition of inclusion? People say to me, well, what's your definition of inclusion, Jim? There are probably a lot of nice definitions out there that you could go look up. But I always say, I don't need some definition out of a book, because everyone listening here to this presentation is living proof of what inclusion is and it means. We experience inclusion as a part of community life. It's a natural component. We don't need a definition for it. It's our life. It's how we live every day. Our life is the definition of inclusion. Unless you're a kid with a disability segregated in a self-contained classroom. That's not the definition of inclusion. So community life is defined by inclusion, by belonging. And here are places where we feel included, where we feel a sense of belonging. Family, church, school, work. Hopefully people feel that in their jobs, in our neighborhoods, and in community organizations. These are all places where we can get, not all kids get it, a lot of kids with disabilities don't get it in their schools. But the reality is that it is a place where community life is defined by inclusion and belonging in things like family, first and foremost, church, school, for many kids, not all, work, neighborhood, and community organizations. So, every day, these places we just went through are places that we feel included and have a sense of belonging. Now, take 1 minute and think of 2 words that describe in your life the experience of being included. This is very important. This is the third context for how we should need to think about and see inclusion. So think of 2 words that describe the experience of being included. Just take 1 minute. I'm going to sit here for a minute, and then I'm going to get back on. I'm not going to hang up. Take a minute, write down 2 words that describe the experience of being included. You have 20 seconds. Okay, so now if we were doing this live, I would ask people to raise their hand and tell me one of the words that they wrote down. So since this is a webinar, you're not able to do that. But everyone just take 2 seconds and say one of their words out loud. It's important to hear the word. Okay, so now let's talk about, here's a group of parents from Fort Worth in 1989 that did this exercise. Here are the words, some of the words, not all of them, but some of the words that they came up with. What does it feel like to be included? One of the people said, I feel accepted. Another person said, I feel connected. I feel respected when I'm included. I feel valued. I feel appreciated. I feel wanted. I feel contributing. Being included makes me feel loved. I feel a sense of belonging when I'm included. One of the words that I always use when I'm included is happy. Being included makes me happy. So, think about the word that you spoke out loud before we went through this list. My guess is, many of you listening to this today uttered a word that is on this list. Because here's one of the universal truths about inclusion. Universal truths about inclusion. It does make us feel accepted, connected, respected, valued, appreciated, wanted, contributing, loved, and belonging. And we don't have to go to a book in order to confirm that. We only have to look inside ourselves and from our own lives. That's the universal truth about inclusion. These words come from our life. There's nothing more truthful than human experience. So this, we know, is what inclusion does for people. It does it for children, and it does it for adults. Because this is what inclusion feels like, regardless of age. If you're more than 3 years old, or if you're 103, you're likely, when someone asks you what does it feel like to be included, to use one of these words. Because it's a universal, the experience of being included produces these universal feelings. Now, think of two words. Let's look at the other side of the coin. There's inclusion and there's exclusion. Think of two words that describe the experience of being excluded, left out. And so, I don't know if you can hear, there's an ambulance in the background. I apologize for that. But think of two words that describe the experience of being left out. Every adult has experienced exclusion or rejection at some point in their life, either in their childhood, their adolescence, in their adult life. You know, it's also part of human experience. At some point in our lives, we end up being excluded or rejected for some reason. Think about what that experience felt like. Take 1 minute and write down two words. Well, actually, now that you've done this once, we're going to give you 30 seconds. Two words. What's it feel like to be excluded? Okay, now, as we did before, I want anyone listening to this webinar to take a couple seconds and utter one of the words that you wrote down so you can hear it. And I'm going to tell you about one of my experiences about being excluded. When I was in first grade, I went to a Catholic school, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more at the end of this presentation. I went to a Catholic school, and Sister Mary David, the nun who taught my first grade class, would take us out. We'd all go out at recess and at lunchtime. And of course, this was in the 50s. I'm 65 years old. So they would divide the boys and the girls. The girls would go to one side and play things like, it was very sexist and stereotypical, jump rope, jacks, hopscotch, what have you. And the boys, we would play dodgeball every day. Now, Sister Mary David would pick out of the boys in the class, there were like 18 of us. She would pick a couple of my classmates to be the captain every day. It's like every ninth day you were going to be a captain. But she would pick a couple kids to be the captain. The rest of us would line up on the fence line to be chosen. Now, back then I walked with crutches. Who do you think was the last kid chosen on that fence line every day for dodgeball? That's right. It was me. And I guess one of the first things you have to wonder is, are you really chosen if you're the last kid on the fence line every day? So, how did I feel about being essentially rejected every freaking day? I felt hurt. I was highly embarrassed and hurt. Now, I'm going to go over the words from the same group of parents in Fort Worth, the words that describe for them what it felt like being excluded and rejected at some point in their life. Here are their words. They felt pain. They felt alone. They felt despair, rejected, angry, sad, shame, empty. And I felt hurt and embarrassed. And some of you out there may have additional words that aren't on that list. But they're what we experience. And they manifest what the truth is about exclusion and rejection. My experience about being rejected when I was 6 years old wasn't when I was an adult. But that hurt and that embarrassment feels like it was about 2 years ago. These feelings are profound. And they're not just experienced by adults. When kids are excluded, when they're segregated, trust me, they feel these same things. How do we know that? Because it's what we felt. That's how we know. It's not because we read about it, because what we ourselves felt when we were excluded. We know what exclusion feels like, what it does to us. So, what's the link to education? Very simple. You know why inclusion is really important? Separate from the issue of how important it is where we receive services, the reason why it's so important where we receive services is because when we receive services in inclusive settings, this is what we feel like. And when we receive services in segregated settings, elderly sections, Hispanic sections, disability sections, this is what we experience. So, what's the link to education? We need to, in our schools, intentionally organize and structure classrooms, lessons, and activities so all students, including students with disabilities, experience belonging, contribution, connection, respect, acceptance, fulfillment, appreciation, happiness. And these feelings come with inclusion. And we need to organize and structure classrooms, lesson activities so students do not experience isolation, loneliness, shame, pain, helplessness, low self-esteem, anger, hurt, and embarrassment, or like pain and embarrassment. That's the reality. When we devote ourselves to inclusion in our schools, we put kids on the left side of this screen where they can experience all of these wonderful feelings. But when we segregate kids, which we do still far too much in our schools, kids experience what's on the right side. And there's no denying it, because it comes from our own lives. This is what we felt when we were segregated. And I oftentimes ask my clients who've been segregated what it feels like at school. And they oftentimes, when I ask them, use exactly these words, or words that are similar, if not, or they use phrases that reflect helplessness, shame, and pain. It is what they feel. So, let's remember, the bottom line. Inclusion matters to everyone. Do what you can to make it happen, because it is critically important. And I want to say this. You know, I read this quote. I practiced law for 40 years. I started reading this quote about 30 years ago every time I went to an IEP meeting for a kid, regardless of whether it was about inclusion or what have you. Because this is how I see every kid. Every single kid with a disability, I see them in this quote. So let me read this, because it's kind of what drove me for 30 years. This is my story. It is a story of a human, not of an, I can't really see the screen very well at the moment, not of an invention or something possible or idealized or otherwise absent figure, but of a unique being of flesh and blood. Yet what a real human being is made of seems to be less understood today than at any time before. Every human is more than just him or herself. He or she represents the unique, the very special, and always significant and remarkable point at which the world's phenomena intersect, only once in this way, and never again. That is why every human story, every student with a disability in any school in this country, why that student's story is important, eternal, and sacred. And why it has been such an honor for me to work with students with disabilities and their families, and to really fight hard on the issue of inclusion. Because it really does reflect the remarkableness. Inclusion really allows the remarkable aspects of every human being to shine. But when people are out of sight and out of mind, segregated, you don't see a lot of that person. But when you're in an inclusive environment, you get to shine. So, inclusion matters to everyone. Make it happen. We're now going to go on to a new subject. And that is functional behavioral assessments. I chose this subject because I think there's I just don't think there's a lot of understanding still in our schools about kids who have behavioral issues. And for kids with Prader-Willi syndrome, who might have behavioral issues related to food and other things, it's really important as a parent or as a guardian, as a relative, that you understand as much as possible about behavior as well about the rights of students with disabilities to certain behavioral type services. So I'm going to take a quick sip of water, and we're going to go on. All right. I am going to talk about functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans. Two key services that kids are entitled to under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and which you can also access under Section 504. And at the end today, I'm going to tell you the difference between IDEA and 504, which is not that important that you understand that distinction yet. Just know that functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans are two things that can be extremely valuable to students with disabilities who have behavioral challenges. So let's begin. Functional behavioral assessments. When are they necessary? We know under both, I'm going to call the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA. Under IDEA and 504, districts are required to identify, locate, and evaluate all children suspected of having a disability. And how do districts do that? School districts are required to conduct an initial evaluation to determine for a student who's suspected of having a disability, to determine if the student has a disability, and to determine what their educational needs are. That's called an initial evaluation. But second, districts are also required to conduct reevaluations at least every 3 years. At least every 3 years, if not sooner, if requested by a parent or teacher. And the purpose of a reevaluation is to determine if the student still has a disability and what their ongoing educational needs are. So interestingly enough, OSEP, which stands for the Office of Special Education Programs in the United States Department of Education, has said that an FBA, which is an acronym for a Functional Behavioral Assessment, it is an evaluation. It is an evaluation. And it can be used to help determine if a child has a disability as part of an initial evaluation. And it can also be used to see whether a child continues to be a child with a disability. So it can be used as part of a reevaluation. So here's what I advise parents. It also says an FBA can also be used to determine the ongoing educational needs of a child. So if a student is suspected of having a behavior-related disability and has been referred for an initial evaluation due to primarily behavioral issues, then an FBA should be conducted as part of the initial evaluation. That's what I believe. Now, 95% of school districts in America do not include FBAs as part of the initial evaluation. But they should include it for every kid who's been initially referred for an evaluation based upon behavioral issues. So if this kid's getting an initial evaluation and most of the concerns, if not all, have been about behavior, a functional behavioral assessment should be included as part of the initial evaluation. We're going to cover in a couple minutes what is a functional behavioral assessment, but know for now it should be included as part of the initial evaluation. And there's this also. If a student is already IDEA eligible, if they already had an initial evaluation, and in that initial evaluation they were determined to have a behavior-related disability like emotional disturbance or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and if they have ongoing behavioral issues, then when their reevaluation is done within that 3-year period, an FBA should be conducted as part of the reevaluation. It's never done, in my experience, but it should be done. So remember, here's the first thing about FBAs. Kid's initial evaluation, if the kid's being referred because of behavior-related issues, an FBA should be a part of that initial evaluation. If the kid's already had an initial evaluation and is a student with a disability, and the disability is a behavior-related disability, the FBA should be part of the reevaluation. It's really important to request and make sure that this happens. Next. When a student has been found eligible for IDEA, they get what's known as an individualized education program. I call that an IEP. And in that IEP, the law requires that there be a consideration of the special factor of behavior. An IEP team must consider the special factor of behavior for any child whose behavior impedes the child's learning, the child's own learning, or that of others. And in doing so, must consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports. It's called PBIS. Very important to kids who have behavioral challenges. So, if a kid who has an IEP has behaviors that impede that child's learning or the learning of that of others, then the IEP team must consider the special factor of behavior, and in doing so must consider the use of PBIS. Well, interestingly enough, the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, has said that the appropriate way to consider and use PBIS is by first conducting an FBA and then developing a behavior intervention plan, which I'm going to call a BIP. So really the only way, if a kid qualifies under the special factor of behavior when you do an IEP, the only way to consider PBIS is to do an FBA in the first place and then include PBIS in the behavior intervention plan that flows from the FBA. So this is another way to get a functional behavioral assessment. And then you can look at these. There are a number of court cases out there that talk about the special factor of behavior. And for example, the first bullet, when a student with a disability has ongoing programmatic behaviors that impede or interfere with their learning or that of others, a district must conduct an FBA and develop a BIP with PBIS, just exactly what we talked about. Another court case said when a student's behaviors are getting worse and they result in repeated suspensions, a district must conduct an FBA and develop a BIP with PBIS when they conduct an IEP meeting, the next IEP meeting. And when a student with a current FBA, let's say a student already has an IEP, has a functional behavioral assessment, and a BIP. But if the student has behaviors that are getting worse, and it's obvious that the behavior intervention plan, i.e. the BIP, is not working, a district must revise that behavior intervention plan and implement PBIS. And the best way to revise that behavior intervention plan and include PBIS is to do another FBA. Because if the behavior intervention plan is not working, it's likely the FBA was not thorough enough. So remember that. Here are examples dealing with the special factor of behavior and the responsibility of IEP teams. Next, IDEA also requires IEP teams to meet, not just annually. Most IEP teams only meet once a year. But IDEA requires IEP teams to meet whenever a student is not making progress either academically or behaviorally toward their annual IEP goals. So if 3 months into the school year, a student is regressing or has only made a month's worth of progress on academics, and behaviorally they're regressing, the IEP team is required to get together, and they shouldn't wait 3 months. But oftentimes in our schools, we see IEPs only as something that must be done annually. That's actually not true. If a kid is not making academic or behavioral progress, the IEP team must come back together and must look at providing additional services, be they academic and or behavior, depending upon where the lack of progress is. So here's an example of when an IEP team should get back together. A student has ongoing behavioral issues that result in failing grades at any semester grading period. If that happens, the IEP team should get back together to review the lack of progress and make changes to the IEP team. And it may mean adding additional academic services and supports or behavioral services and supports. If a student is repeatedly suspended, it can happen over the course of the first couple months of school even, then the IEP team should get back together. They certainly shouldn't wait till the end of the school year. A student has worsening behavior issues. In all of these instances, the IEP team needs to meet. And in my view, the IEP team should recommend, in these behavioral instances, where there are behavioral issues, they should recommend an FBA be conducted and that a behavior intervention plan then be drafted after the FBA is concluded. Next, we're not going to talk a great deal about this, but many of you know if a kid's been put out of school for more than 10 days, they're entitled to a manifestation determination review. That review looks at whether or not the student's behavior relating to them being put out of school, whether their behavior is related to their disability. If their behavior that led to them being suspended and removed from school now for more than 10 days, if the behavior that did that is related to their disability, then they are entitled to a functional behavioral assessment. So if the manifestation determination review, which is done by the IEP team, decides a student's behavior, student has been out of school more than 10 days for disciplinary reasons, is related to the student's disability, they get a functional behavioral assessment. So they must develop and implement also a BIP. So they do the FBA first, then they have to also do a behavior intervention program. If the student has a behavior intervention program already, then it must be reviewed and revised if there's a determination that the student's behavior is related to their disability. So one, the student gets an FBA, and number two, if the student has a behavior intervention plan already, it has to be reviewed and revised. Okay? Next, this should say manifestation determination review if the student's behavior is not related. You're going to need to correct this slide on your own if it's not related. Okay? So, if it's not related, then a student is not automatically entitled to an FBA or a behavior intervention plan, a BIP. However, the law says a school district is not required to provide it if the behavior is not related, but if it's appropriate, an FBA and a BIP should still be provided, if it's appropriate. Mostly what you're going to hear is, if the behavior is not related to a student's disability, the student doesn't get an FBA and a BIP. That is not true. That is not what the law says. Even if a student's behavior is not related to their disability, although the district is not required automatically to do an FBA and provide a behavior intervention plan, if it is appropriate to do it, then the district must. So here's an example, in my view, of where it is appropriate, even if the behavior is not related. So if a student does not have an FBA or a BIP, yet has an MDR due to repeated suspensions totaling more than 10 school days, in my view, if a kid's already been out of school more than 10 days for behavior purposes, behavioral interventions are obviously needed. And thus an FBA and a BIP are appropriate. I just find it incredible. Sometimes kids are out of schools for 20, 25 days, and the district says, well, their behavior is unrelated. But let's be clear, even if that's true, they've been out of school for 20, 25 days. They have ongoing behavioral issues that need to be addressed. They need behavioral interventions. So remember, the very fact that kids are out of school for more than 10 days, maybe a district will fight you if it's 12 or 13 days, but if the kid's been out now 17, 18, 24, 25 days, I don't care if the behavior is unrelated to their disability. They have significant ongoing behavioral issues, and they need significant behavioral interventions. Because these behavioral issues are impeding their learning and the learning of others. So, they need it. It is appropriate then to provide them with an FBA and a BIP. Okay? So, sometimes we have to look beyond just the habits we fall into. One of the habits is, if the behavior is unrelated, you'll always hear from school people you don't get an FBA or a BIP. Not true. Here's another important requirement about FBAs, and that is IDEA has a peer-reviewed research requirement. This is really important, both academically and behaviorally. What does this requirement mean? Well, IDEA says a student with a disability's IEP must include a statement of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services based upon peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable to be provided to the student. So special education, related services, and supplementary aids and services, those that are provided must be based upon peer-reviewed research, if practicable. And what does if practical mean? It means state school districts and school personnel must select and use methods that research, not people's opinions. Research has shown to be effective to the extent that methods based upon peer-reviewed research are available. Trust me, there's peer-reviewed research on reading curriculums, on math curriculums, math instruction techniques, reading instruction techniques, and on behavioral techniques as well. Let me give you some examples from the behavioral perspective. IDEA's peer-reviewed research requirement applies to functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans. That's the first thing. So whenever you're fighting for an FDA and a BIP, know that peer-reviewed research standards apply. So, several cases have found that students' behavior intervention plans were inconsistent with or contrary to or without peer-reviewed research support. And here are some of the examples from cases. In one case, a student had a BIP that included interventions that were inconsistent with and contrary to peer-reviewed research. And in fact, the behavior intervention plan reinforced problematic behaviors. So, in this case, the repeated use of timeout for students with escape behaviors. I mean, if a student is trying to escape, is engaging in behavior to escape, and you put that kid in timeout, you've essentially given the student what they want. And here's an example of that. A student is behind in reading. So every time reading class begins, the student starts acting out. So they won't be called on because they don't want to be called on because they're behind and they may look what to their peers? Fill in the blank. If you're having a hard time reading the material that's being taught, you know you're behind. You're willing to act out to be removed from the class in order to avoid looking what to your peers? The word would be stupid. And this is what kids have told me. It is their word. I don't want to look stupid to my friends. I'd much rather go to timeout. So here's a kid who's lacking the reading skills, The kid acts out. The kid's not a bad kid. The kid's merely trying to protect themselves so they don't look stupid. So what do we do to that kid? We treat the kid oftentimes like he or she is a bad kid, and we send them to timeout. Now, what was the kid looking for? To get sent out of reading. We've just reinforced that kid's escape behavior. That kid was acting out in order to escape. And now we have given the kid what they want. And so now they've escaped to timeout room. What happens down in timeout room? Do you think they're catching up on their reading? No, they're falling farther and farther behind. So when tomorrow rolls around, is the need to act out going to be less or more? Well, tomorrow, when the kid shows up, the kid's going to be farther behind. The need to act out is going to be more. So we created a behavior intervention plan, and this was the case in this court case, where every time the kid acted out in reading, the kid was sent to timeout. He engaged in escape behavior to get out of reading, we sent him out. It reinforced his problematic behaviors, which really weren't all that problematic. They were survival behaviors. But in sending him out, the kid fell farther and farther behind, and the need to act out grew more and more every day. What did that kid really need? That kid needed to be taught reading. Until that kid was given the reading skills that he or she needed in order to stay in that class and keep up, they were going to continue to act out. And sending them to timeout was had very detrimental consequences for the kid. Didn't help the kid, and only put the kid in a position where they had to continue to act out more and more every day. So, you know, that kind of behavior intervention plan, there's no peer-reviewed research to support sending a kid out of a classroom who's engaging in escape behavior. We need to figure out ways to keep that kid in the classroom. Here's another case. A behavior intervention plan used a point and level reward system. A point and level reward system that had no peer-reviewed research basis. Whenever you're told that they're going to use a point system for a son or daughter, you should wonder and ask, is there peer-reviewed research for this point system? Because it's almost non-existent. So what did they find out here? This point system was used for a kid with autism. There's no peer-reviewed research for a point system for kids with autism. Moreover, this kid did not even understand how the point system worked. So clearly, it was counterproductive. Oftentimes, behavior intervention plans don't include positive behavior interventions and support. And that's really ironic because PBIS is a peer-reviewed, research-based service. Positive behavior interventions and supports are peer-reviewed, research-based. They are the one thing that is. Point systems, sending kids to timeout who engage in escape behavior, there's no peer-reviewed research for that. There's a ton of peer-reviewed research for using positive behavior interventions and supports to modify kids' behaviors. So remember, that's another way to get PBIS. It is peer-reviewed, research-based, where many things in behavior intervention plans are not. Okay, we're going to talk about behavior and in that context, about functional behavioral assessment, so you can understand what a functional behavioral assessment is, and so that you can have an impact on the conducting of a functional behavioral assessment. By knowing what an FBA is, functional behavioral assessment, FBA, you're going to be able to make sure that it complies with the peer review research standard in IDEA, because there are peer-reviewed research standards for FBAs. I'm going to take a sip of water. Bear with me for 1 second. Okay, let's just start with behavior generally. Here's what we know about behavior. Well, I'm going to go back. I'm going to retract that. Let's start with what a functional behavioral assessment does. It assesses the function of a student's behavior. What is the function? What is the why of the behavior? And here's what we know about the functions of behavior. All behavior serves one of three functions, or it could be two of three functions. Sometimes it could be even three. But it at least serves all behavior, be it that of students, i.e. children, adolescents, young adults, or adults. All behavior serves a function or purpose. The first function it serves is it allows students or adults to get something desirable. Second, another function that behavior serves is to escape or avoid something undesirable. Third, behavior allows us to communicate, i.e. send a message or communicate a need. Now think about this. For those of you who are listening to this webinar, think about, have you engaged in behavior in the past 3 days in order to get something? Just say yes or no. I'll be able to hear you. I'm kidding, but almost everyone is saying yes. Have you engaged in behavior in the last 3 days or a week to escape or avoid something undesirable, unpleasant conversation? Have you engaged in escape behavior? I can tell you I engaged in escape behavior this morning already. Or have you engaged in behavior that communicates, the behavior itself communicates a message or a need? Sure. You know, for students who cannot communicate, oftentimes kids with autism, it's a communication disorder first and foremost. They have communication difficulties. So they use behavior to behavior is a language for them. But behavior is a language for all of us too. But we see it more with kids who don't communicate. But all behavior serves a function. Get something, avoid or escape something, send a message. Here's the other thing about behavior. All behavior occurs within a context. Behavior may occur in a certain setting. Let's look at school settings. A student's behavior may occur in the cafeteria, may only occur in the classroom, may occur in common areas like hallways. So that's a context. It may occur in a certain setting. It may occur under certain conditions. A student's behavior may occur only during reading class. Remember the example I just went over. We know the reason why too, now. We know the function of that kid's behavior now too. It may occur under another condition when there's a substitute teacher. Now, every adult on this webinar at some point in their life was a child. Remember what it was like when we had substitute teachers? Did our behavior change? You bet. Many of us thought that was a free day. It was an acting out day. My behavior went in the toilet when we had substitute teachers. It's sad. Look back on it as an adult, but my behavior was something radically different from when, like, Sister Mary David was teaching me. And here's the other thing about another context for behavior. It may only occur during different types of activities. It may occur only during recess, a student's behavior. Maybe it occurs only during assemblies. So we know two things. One, there's a function to all behaviors. Get something, avoid something, send a message. Two, there's a context. Behavior occurs in certain settings, maybe only under certain conditions, different types of activities. Those are the first two things we need to remember about behavior. This is going to be important to be sure these are looked at in a functional behavioral assessment. Number 3. Oh, sorry. So what does a functional behavioral assessment do? It examines the function and context of a student's behavior. It looks beyond the student's particular misbehavior and seeks to discover the underlying function or purpose of the behavior. In other words, the why of the behavior. Why is a student behaving? Just doesn't look at the behavior, it looks underneath it, to the side of it, behind the behavior to see why is the student behaving this way. What is the function? It examines thus a student's underlying motivation to get something, escape and avoid something, or communicate a message. It also examines the context of a misbehavior. In the example of the kid who only acted out in reading class, it is important to know that context, because there is obviously something about reading as opposed to math or social studies where the kid's not acting out. There's something about that context, the reading class, that is very important. And it wouldn't do any good to go in and analyze a kid's behavior in social studies if where they're acting out is in reading. You'd be in the wrong class. So that's what a functional behavior does, functional behavioral assessment. And now, let's look at the conducting of a functional behavioral assessment. And here's where your role is really important. Really important. You know at this point, every behavior serves a function and has a context. But now we're going to do the FBA. What's the first thing that needs to happen? This comes from peer-reviewed research. First, we need to identify and find the student's target. This is what you're going to hear from school people, and school people are on the line. This is just, the language that you use, which is fine. The student's target behavior, that's the problem behavior. We need to define the target behavior, i.e. problem behavior, through concrete descriptions. Let me give you a couple examples. Trish is aggressive. That's not concrete. Aggressive is in the eye of the beholder. That is a very vague term. What is aggressive to one person may not be aggressive to another at all. So the word aggressive really doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't. You get 5 people together, 5 adults in a room, we're all going to have different views of what we consider aggressive behavior, unless it's really extreme, then we'll agree. But for 9 out of 10 behaviors, maybe only 2 of us agree on behavior number 1 that's aggressive. 8 people don't. So it's vague. Versus, Trish hits other students on the playground. Now that defines what aggressive means. Trish hits other students on the playground. That's a concrete definition of Trish's target, i.e. problem behavior. Trish is aggressive. What do we know from that? Nothing. Trish hits other students on the playground. Now we know exactly what the behavior is. It's concrete. Tristan is disruptive. This is the most common word that is used for kids with behavioral issues. They're disruptive. What does that mean? Well, it means something different to like it means something. You get 5 people together, they're going to have different views on what's disruptive. It's, again, in the eye of the beholder. Disruptive is a vague term. So let's define Tristan's so-called disruptive behavior in concrete terms. Tristan makes numerous irrelevant and loud comments during reading class. Now that's concrete. Disruptive tells us nothing. But this, what does he do? He makes numerous irrelevant and loud comments during reading class. Numerous comments that are irrelevant, that are loud, and that occur during reading. That's concrete versus Tristan is disruptive. So the first thing when you're a part of the conducting of an FBA, and you will be, the IEP team does it, you need to define the student, your son, your daughter, your nephew, your niece, your sister, your brother's behavior in concrete terms. Second, we need to, again, this is peer-reviewed, research-based. As part of an FBA, the second thing that must be done is we need to identify the context and settings in which the target, i.e. problem behavior, occurs. So, for Trish, what is the context for her behaviors? Where do they occur? On the playground. Do they occur in the classroom? No. So where they are most likely to occur is on the playground. Where they're least likely to occur is the classroom. Tristan is just the opposite. Do his behaviors occur on the playground? No. They occur in the classroom. Could you tell from the word disruptive where his behaviors occur? No. Can you tell from the word for Trish aggressive where her behaviors occur? No. But now that we've defined not only the behavior but the setting, as we come to again, we want to identify the behavior in concrete terms and the setting. So for Trish, the setting is the playground, not the classroom. For Tristan, it's the classroom. It's not the playground, it's not the hallway, it's not the cafeteria. So we have now defined the context. Next, is the problem related to a skill deficit? Put a star by this slide. I did disability rights work for 40 years. I'm just recently retired. Half of the clients who I represented, at least half, who had behavioral issues, their issues were related to skill deficits. Skill deficits. If there's evidence that a student doesn't know how to perform a skill and therefore cannot, a student's problem behavior is likely to help him or her escape and avoid a frustrating academic task. 50% or more of the kids who act out in school are doing so to protect themselves because they don't have the skills. They're trying to escape, and in 95% of the cases, they are punished in a way where they get out of the classroom or they're suspended. But we're reinforcing the behavior because they wanted to get out. Now we've punished them in a way or sent them to timeout where they're now out. But they wanted to get out because they had a skill deficit. Sending them home or sending them to timeout means their skill deficit only grows. It only becomes more and more magnified. So the third thing we always need to do when we're conducting an FBA is look to see if a kid has a skill deficit. Because the only way that kid is going to change his or her behavior is when they have the skills necessary to stay in that classroom. Those kids need to be taught the skills that they're lacking, be they in math or reading, language arts, what have you. And until these kids need intensive academic remediation. They do not need timeout. They do not need suspensions, which only make their skill deficits worse. They need someone to understand that they're trying to protect themselves as kids. so they don't look stupid, so they're not embarrassed in front of their peers. So, the third thing we need to look at is see if kids have skill deficits, because if they do, they have to be remediated or their behaviors are going to continue. But it's ironic, when you remediate kids with skill deficits, when you fix those, bring them up to speed academically, those behaviors almost universally, the problematic behaviors they were having, the target behaviors, they go away. Because now there's no reason to escape. Kids have the skills. They're comfortable. They feel safe in the classroom. But if a kid doesn't have a skill, timeout, it serves as a reinforcer of problem behavior. It sanctions escape or avoidance behavior, and it aggravates a student's skill deficits. So number 3, look to see if a kid has a skill deficit. That's the third thing that happens. Number 4, does the kid have a performance deficit? This is the opposite of skill deficits. Here the student has the skill or the skills, but for some reason they won't perform. We know the student has the skills, but they won't perform. Math class starts up, the student has the math skills, but they're acting out all the time. Not related to a skill deficit, so what's going on? Well, think about this. Part of this is just empathy, remembering that we were children. Remember when you were in school, were there subjects you liked more than other subjects in high school? Raise your hand. No matter where you're sitting right now listening to this webinar, hands are going up all around the country. Because we all know that in high school there were classes we liked, which we consequently did better in the vast majority of instances, and classes we did not like or we were bored in, even though we had skills, we didn't perform well because we didn't care about those courses. I have a nephew who's far more intelligent than I am, far more. He's brilliant, but you know, he's never liked English and the language arts. He's always liked the sciences. So he's always gotten C's in English and language arts, although he clearly could be getting an A, because he likes math and the sciences. Yes, he's unusual. But he always got C's. And, you know, he always had problems in those courses because he did act out. He was bored, you know? And so oftentimes kids have performance deficits. And, you know, we were those same kids. We had performance deficits in classes. And oftentimes in classes where we had performance deficits, we wouldn't perform because we were bored, we acted out. So one of the things we need to look at is, are there students who are acting out? Do they have performance deficits? They have the skills, but they're bored. They see no payoff for performing. In this instance, we've all been there. But here's the thing that works for these kids. Kids with performance deficits, you know, they're not interested in English language arts. What works for these kids to change their behaviors of acting out, being the joker man in class or the joker woman, is to make them the team leader of a group in English language arts. They get attention, which is oftentimes what they're acting out is what they're looking for anywhere. Anyway, they're bored in the class, they start acting out, they're trying to get attention. You know what? If you make them the team leader of an assignment or of a project in English language arts where they're the team leader, it's remarkable what this does for kids, because now they get a lot of attention, they get respect from their peers, and they can help kids who may have skill deficits, help bring them up to speed. In every class of 24 kids, there are 7 good student teachers. Why not use kids with performance deficits? They have the skills already to work with, in teams, kids who have skill deficits. It's very likely, like my cousin Kevin, who's brilliant, that if he was told he was going to be a team leader in English language arts and 6 other kids were on his team looking to him to lead them, to get them through a project, that he could teach really well kids in the group who were struggling with skill deficits. And he could give them time that the teacher doesn't. So kids with performance deficits, we can not only eliminate their behavioral issues, but we can put them in a position where they can help other kids as well who may have skill deficits, which lead to those kids' own behavioral issues. So we just need to be smart. But in order to do that, we have to look at not only skill deficits for kids in doing an FBA, but performance deficits. Now, let's look at so we started the FBA. We defined the behavior in concrete terms and also what the setting is, the context of the behavior. We looked at whether or not the kid has skill deficits that might be driving the behavior. Does the kid have performance deficits? I believe about 20%, 15 to 20% of all behaviors that are considered problematic in our schools are related to performance deficits. 50% or more related to skill deficits. That's over 70% of the behaviors in our schools, if we examine what's really going on, are related to skill and performance deficits. So if we don't look at those, we're going to be missing out on what drives about 70% of the behaviors. So we've done those 4 things. Now we're going to start the functional behavioral assessment. Here are the components of it. Indirect assessment. The first thing we do is we interview the student. Even if the student's 5 years old, he or she should be interviewed about their behaviors. We should always interview the student's parents, the student's teacher, and other pertinent adults. Remember, Trish is sitting other students on the playground. Who do we want to interview as part of the indirect assessment, the first component of an FBA? We want to interview the playground monitors, because that's where her behavior is occurring. To interview her teacher is not going to be much help. What we really need to interview are the playground monitors. That's a pertinent adult. For Tristan, do we want to interview the playground monitor or monitors? No, they don't see his target behaviors. We want to interview his teacher or teachers, because his issues are we want to interview his reading teacher, not all of his teachers, whoever's teaching reading. So, indirect assessment. You cannot conduct an FBA if you haven't conducted a valid FBA, one that comports with peer-reviewed research standards, if you haven't interviewed the student, the student's parents, and the pertinent adults. Direct assessment. This is where the student must be observed in the context where the behavior is most likely to occur. Trish on the playground, Tristan in reading class. And here's what must be done as part of a direct assessment. We must record a baseline. What is the frequency of the target behavior? In a 45-minute lunch period, how often does Trish engage in hitting kids? And how often is she involved in what's called the replacement behavior? So we do a baseline, the frequency of her problem behavior, and what's the frequency of good behavior. So for like with Tristan, we know his behavior is, he has numerous instances of talking loudly and in an irrelevant fashion in reading class. So that would be considered as target behavior, talking loudly and in an irrelevant manner about something not irrelevant to reading. So how many times does he engage in that target behavior in every hour-long reading period? 5 times? And how many times do we see him acting appropriately in reading? Raising his hand, sitting quietly. How many instances is he able to do that? So we do a baseline. What's his target? What's the frequency of his target behavior? What's the frequency of his replacement, desired behavior, with the behavior we're looking for? We also look at what are the antecedents. What occurs prior to the behavior? Well, in Tricia's case, we need to look at when does she start hitting kids? What seems to be happening? And in reading, when is Tristan acting out? Is it when they start calling on people in his row? Is it the moment he walks into reading class? The antecedent is walking into reading class? Or can he stay quiet and act appropriately until they start calling kids in his row or calling out names alphabetically and his is coming up in the next 4 or 5 kids? So what's the antecedent? And then what's the consequence of the behavior? If it's for Tristan, if we're sending him the timeout, if that's the consequence, what kind of impact is it having? So we need to figure out what's the baseline, what happens before the target behaviors occur, and what happens after. Okay, so that's the direct assessment. It's done of the student. It's direct observation. Then we review all the records. This is part of the FBA. Then we take the interviews, we take the direct observations, we take all of the records, and the IEP team reviews all of that information. The IEP team reviews all of that information and analyzes the information. And the point of that is to come up with a hypothesis statement. In that hypothesis statement, the team is trying to figure out, the IEP team, by looking at the interviews, the direct observation information, and all the records. By reviewing, looking at all that data, we're trying to come up with a hypothesis statement about the function of the student's behavior. So, the best way to do this is what's called a threefold statement. You want to be sure, when as part of an IEP team doing an FBA, that the hypothesis statement is threefold. When X occurs, student does Y in order to achieve Z. Let's talk about that kid in reading class who doesn't have the skills. So, when X occurs, X is, in this instance, when reading occurs, student does Y. Student starts acting out, talking out loud, making jokes, doing a lot of irrelevant things. That's the student's behavior in order to achieve Z. Because the kid has a skill deficit, when reading starts, the kid acts out in a variety of concrete ways that we previously defined in order to escape. In order to escape. Now we've figured it out. The function of the kid's behavior in acting out is not to get something, but it's to escape or avoid something, and that is being called on for reading and made to look stupid. So the function of the behavior is escape. And why does the kid need to escape? Now we know, because the kid has a skill deficit. Now we know what's going on with the kid. When the kid walks into reading class, the kid's behind. The kid knows he's behind. So the kid knows that in order not to be called on, the kid has to act out in order to protect himself from looking stupid. So the kid acts out in order to escape. And sure enough, what's the consequence for the kid's behavior? He gets sent to timeout. The consequence is reinforcing that behavior and actually aggravating the kid's skill deficit. So the hypothesis statement. It should predict the general conditions under which the behavior is most and least likely to occur and the probable consequences that serve to maintain it. So we have this threefold statement. And let's see, does it predict the general conditions under which the behavior is most likely to occur? Reading class. When reading class occurs, does it say any other class? No. So it's least likely to occur in other classes. And the probable consequences that serve to maintain it. In this case, the student's acting out results in the following consequence: timeout or suspension. Well, that's maintaining the kid's behavior because the kid was trying to escape in the first place. So their skill deficit wouldn't be on display. So we now know what the general condition is under which the behavior occurs, reading class. It doesn't occur in none of his other classes, and how the consequence serves to maintain it. Timeout or suspension. Aggravates the kid's skill deficit. So, next step. You know, there are free resources for each training model that are available for downloading at the PWSA website. And if you need assistance with a school issue, please contact PWSA at the following number, and you can ask to speak to a family support counselor. If you have any questions or comments about this module, and I'm going to do another module that's going to get into behavior intervention plans, related services, and extended school year. But for this first module, if you have any questions or comments about the module or WSEAT in general, please contact Evan Farrar at the email address here on the screen. And no portion of this is obviously reproducible without permission of PWSA and or the presenters of this module. This concludes the webinar. Thank you for attending. I really mean that. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you find this information helpful.